who has shown that Britain under Labour will be a strong leader within NATO, committed to spending 2% of our national income on defence, and committed to ensure that those who put their lives on the line for this country get real terms pay rises and decent living conditions, and that their service and their sacrifice deserves that. And in dark and dangerous times in the world, Britain must be equally strong and equally committed to defence, development and diplomacy. And that is what we offer on this stage, and that is what Labour will do in government, and that is we guarantee. But conference, make no mistake, these are indeed dark and dangerous times for the world. And too many times the problems we face come down to people abusing their power and ignoring the rules and values that should govern our world. From Venezuela to the Philippines, we see the rule of law ignored, and originally democratic governments turning increasingly into autocratic regimes. From Myanmar to Yemen, we see human rights ignored, and flagrant attacks against ordinary citizens, all too often using British-made weapons. From Kashmir to Israel and Palestine, we see efforts at diplomacy ignored, and actions taken on both sides which will make peace harder to achieve. From Syria to Sudan, we see the Geneva Convention ignored, and despots committing war crimes with total freedom and impunity. All across Europe, we see basic rules of humanity and the basic lessons of history ignored, as cowardly terrorists stalk our city streets and vicious extremist parties rise in the polls. And of course, in North Korea, we see the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty ignored and all the terrifying consequences that the world is now facing. Taken all together, what we are seeing today is the biggest challenge to the world order since the 1930s and the collapse of the League of Nations. And if you believe, as I do, in what Jeremy has called a world based on rules and laws, then this is the time, more than ever, when we need our leaders to stand up for that world order, to stand up for human rights and international treaties, and to insist on working through the United Nations for peace. But instead, conference, we now have a President of the United States who believes that none of these laws, none of these rules apply to him. Imposing a travel ban on Muslims, equivocating over illegal settlements, reneging on the Paris Climate Treaty, imperiling the nuclear deal with Iran, and threatening to totally destroy North Korea, a country of 20 million men and women and 5 million children. That is not what we need from the leader of the free world. And to be honest, conference, it's more like what we would expect from a rogue dictator. And what makes it even worse is that this government and this Tory Prime Minister pathetically go along with it all, walking hand in hand with Trump at the White House, supine, sycophantic and spineless. A vain hope that Trump will rise to the rescue after Brexit with some fantasy free trade deal? I don't think so. Because for this Tory government, that's what their foreign policy has come down to. No values or ethics, no rules, no principles, just a simple case of what works out best for the bottom line. How else do they explain why last week Theresa May was in New York finally announcing the suspension of cooperation with the military in Myanmar because of their actions in Rakhine, while on the very same day, Michael Fallon was in Jeddah signing a deal to increase our cooperation with the military of Saudi Arabia, wantonly ignoring their actions in Yemen. Let's call it for what it is. It's rank hypocrisy. It's rank hypocrisy. But it also illustrates a basic fact, that the world we want to see, a world governed by ethics and values, a world based on rules and laws, will never truly exist as long as governments and world leaders get to decide themselves when it suits them to play by the rules and when those rules can safely be ignored. The world we want will never exist when governments like Theresa May's think that it's perfectly okay to loudly condemn those that they regard as enemies, but then fall utterly silent when their friends in Bahrain are rounding up, torturing and executing civilian protesters, or their friends in Saudi Arabia drop cluster bombs on innocent children in Yemen. In fact, if they were just silent, that would be an improvement. But instead, we had to listen to Michael Fallon saying that thousands of children killed and injured by airstrikes in Yemen are just a consequence of Saudi Arabia defending itself. Defending itself. But conference, it doesn't have to be this way. Labour can, Labour will do things differently when we are back in power. And we can commit to one concrete step that we will take today. For too long, successive governments in this country have taken decisions on granting arms export licenses behind closed doors and shrouded in secrecy. Just 2 months ago, we had the ludicrous situation where the campaigners trying to stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia for use in Yemen had their judicial review rejected on the basis of government evidence presented in closed court, secret courts, so that they were not even allowed to hear the evidence, let alone challenge it. The fact is that arms export decisions made by Tory ministers are entirely subjective assessments taken without proper parliamentary scrutiny, without listening to independent expert advice, but listening far too much to lobbyists for the arms trade and repressive foreign regimes. A process that leads to the nonsensical double standards where the government can decide too late that selling arms to Myanmar is wrong, but immediately increase its sales to Saudi. It is an arms control regime that was already outdated, but which the Tories have systematically abused and undermined and left fatally discredited. And as the 4 shadow ministers responsible, Barry, Mia, Kate and I, we have agreed that this must change. So just as the new Labour governments elected in 1997 and 2001 immediately reformed the way decisions were made on monetary policy and competition policy, the next Labour government will immediately reform the way decisions are made on the export of arms.
Yes!
A wholesale reform of the legal and regulatory framework, fully implementing the International Arms Trade Treaty with clear rules, tests and criteria for decision-making, based on independent expert advice and the objective assessment of evidence. A new system that will prevent the misuse and abuse of licenses and adhere to the principles of transparency, true parliamentary accountability and freedom from undue influence. Because conference, it's not enough for us just to be better than the Tories. We must set an entirely new standard for Britain and a shining example to the world. And quite frankly, if that sounds like setting our ambitions high, well, damn right it is. And we shouldn't be apologising for that. You know, I heard Chuka say yesterday, over-promising and under-delivering is one of the reasons why there was such fury with the Blair government. And when it comes to foreign policy, darn right. I totally agree with that statement. But the way we avoid that mistake next time round isn't to water down the promises we make, it's to keep the promises we make and make sure we deliver them.